As we turn to this week's roundtable discussion, we're going to focus entirely on Afghanistan this evening. At yesterday's London conference and beyond, there was renewed talk this week of trying to negotiate an end to the long war in Afghanistan. And joining us once again tonight, Gideon Rose, managing editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, and James Rubin, an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and a former Assistant Secretary of State in the Clinton administration. Thank you very much for joining us. Good to see you both again here. So we just saw that spot about the secret negotiations that have taken place, about reintegrating the Taliban. Where do you see this going? Do you see this going very far, Jamie?
Well, I think there's really two tracks. There's a military track and a diplomatic track. And the General McChrystal, who has gotten the troops that he says he needs to reverse the Taliban's momentum, wants to work with the diplomats to synchronize the tracks. And I think the idea here is that if there is, in the coming couple of months, as there's expected to be a major NATO offensive, and the Taliban really sees that they have no chance of really winning, if the feelers are put out in the meantime and the doors opened and Karzai and the West and all of the international community is showing that there is some middle ground for them, that's the best chance to use a combination of diplomacy and force to end the war on, this is crucial, on terms that are acceptable, because allowing the Taliban back into government is one thing. Allowing the Taliban style of government is something else that is not acceptable, I think, both to the Afghan people as a whole and to the international community.
Gideon, what are the mechanics of this? How would this work? Who would we be talking to? And do you think this can be accomplished?
Well, I think a lot is unclear here, and what makes it even more complicated is the fact that there are different strategies being pursued by different players, so that the American government and military and diplomats have been in favor of reintegration of lower-level foot soldiers, mid-level officials, and so forth, peeling off or co-opting some of the insurgent forces, for example. Some of the things that the Karzai government has been recently talking about are much grander. They involve not just reintegration, but reconciliation with opposing political factions, and you hear talk about ending the war and some kind of peace deal. I think that it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to see the war end with some kind of compromise deal, whereas it's more realistic to expect.
You don't think this is going to be a strategy that's going to bring peace to Afghanistan ultimately, either of you?
I don't think there's going to be a peace conference. I think Gideon is right. There's not going to be a peace conference where Mullah Omar and Karzai and the international community sign some accord and all is well. I do, however, think it's possible that the different strains of the Taliban will be responded to in different ways. There will be those who are irreconcilable, connected with al-Qaeda. Mullah Omar, I would put in that camp. Then there are those who at various times have supported the Taliban leadership, perhaps in Quetta, but see the writing on the wall that the U.S. is going to stay and that their momentum is reversing. And then there are those that Gideon was talking about primarily that are really not ideological Taliban, that are fighting for whatever reason that can see a better deal with the West. So there's three different kinds of Taliban, and I think for different strokes for different folks.
Right. Yeah, so Gideon, what do you think this is an opportunity for, then?
Well, I'm somewhat cynical about this, but in a positive way. I see this as the use of carrots to essentially divide and conquer various insurgent groups and essentially help win the war or make progress in the war by reducing your enemy to the absolute die-hard components who cannot in any way, shape, or form be co-opted. Essentially, all this is a sensible approach to try to co-opt, reintegrate, bring back in from the cold any members of the insurgency or opposition who could possibly be lived with, who were willing to renounce violence and who are willing to accept the Afghan constitution. Those should be the only things that we hold out on. And anybody else who agrees with that, bring them back in. But then you're still going to be left with some rump groups that you'll have to actually fight. And so this is part of the process of fighting the war rather than a route to solving it or ending it.
And what would the incentive be for these groups, these different factions, these different elements to come to the table and to make peace, or to take money in order to make peace?
Well, I think it's both a negative and a positive incentive, and that's why the offensive this spring is really important. If the Taliban and all of the different groups are convinced that NATO is there to stay for an extended period, that they are determined to operate militarily across the country and reverse the momentum the Taliban have created, you create a negative incentive. In other words, they're going to stop getting killed. They're going to stop facing this very powerful NATO force that's growing there. On the positive side, I think it depends. There are suggestions that there will be reintegration funds for education, for jobs, for local governance that would involve local, say, Pashtun that are affiliated with the Taliban. But again, I think the hardest part of this is convincing the Afghan people, both Taliban, non-Taliban, and the Karzai government, that we're in this for long enough that they can't wait us out. And that's why this spring offensive is so important, and the words that the West uses are so important.
And the interesting part of that, I agree entirely with Jamie, and the interesting part of that, though, is the American people have to be convinced that this is worth doing so that our effort can be sustainable. Simply saying we're in this for the long haul won't work if the American domestic support for the operation evaporates so much that the administration is forced to cave. And so some kind of progress, and even, frankly, the pledge to start pulling out in 2011 is, I think, part of the Obama administration's careful juggling strategy to convince Americans that this is not an open-ended separating wound, but rather something that's a sustainable, viable operation, that costs are going to be capped. So you're trying to tell the Americans you're not going to pay too much forever, but you're trying to tell the locals, don't worry, we're here, we're going to stay and support you, and the bad guys, you can't just wait us out.
All right.
That's a tough balance to walk, and
Very much
hopefully they can walk it.
All right. Well, thank you, Jamie Rubin, Gideon Rose, both of you. Great to see you. Thank you.